Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might just shatter everything you think you know about existence itself. The question that's haunted humanity since we first looked up at the stars and wondered if any of this is actually real. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: you wake up tomorrow morning, reach for your phone, and suddenly realize you can't tell the difference between the dream you just had and the reality you think you're living. Your coffee tastes exactly like the coffee in your dream. The sunlight streaming through your window feels identical to the light you remember from sleep. Every sensation, every thought, every memory could be nothing more than electrical impulses firing in patterns you'll never truly understand. This isn't science fiction. This is the reality crisis that's been keeping philosophers awake at night for thousands of years, and quantum physicists scratching their heads for the past century. Because here's the terrifying truth that no one wants to talk about. We have absolutely no way to prove that any of this is real. I'm talking about the fundamental nature of everything you've ever experienced. Every kiss, every sunset, every moment of joy or pain could be nothing more than an elaborate simulation running inside a brain you might not even possess. And tonight, we're going to dive headfirst into the rabbit hole that makes Alice's Wonderland look like a children's playground. You see, there's a scientist who's been wrestling with this question for decades. Someone who's spent their entire career studying consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence itself. But here's where it gets interesting. This brilliant mind, this person who's dedicated their life to understanding the very fabric of reality, has developed a peculiar habit. Every day at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, they fall asleep, not by choice, not from exhaustion. It just happens, like clockwork. And in those moments between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and dreams, they've discovered something that could change everything we think we know about what's real and what isn't. But before we meet our sleepy scientist, we need to understand what we're really asking when we ask if reality is real. Because this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate you'd have in a college dorm room at 2 in the morning. This is the foundation of everything. Every decision you make, every relationship you build, every goal you pursue rests on the assumption that the world around you actually exists. Think about it right now. As you're watching this, you're assuming that your eyes are real, that the screen you're looking at exists, that the sounds you're hearing are actually reaching your ears through vibrations in the air. But what if none of that is true? What if you're a brain in a jar, being fed electrical signals that create the illusion of experience? What if you're in a coma, dreaming this entire life? What if you're a character in someone else's dream, and when they wake up, you simply cease to exist? These aren't just crazy ideas dreamed up by philosophers with too much time on their hands. These are serious questions being asked by serious scientists using serious methods to probe the deepest mysteries of existence. And the answers they're finding are far stranger than anything Hollywood has ever imagined. Let me tell you about quantum mechanics for a moment. Not the boring textbook version, but the reality bending, mind melting implications of what happens when you look closely at the building blocks of everything you think you know. At the quantum level, particles don't have definite positions until they're observed. They exist in what scientists call superposition, essentially being in multiple places at once until someone or something measures them. This isn't theory. This has been proven in laboratories around the world thousands of times. The very act of observation changes reality at the most fundamental level, which means that reality at its core might not exist independently of consciousness. The universe might literally be creating itself as we observe it, moment by moment, measurement by measurement. But it gets weirder, much weirder. There's something called quantum entanglement, where two particles can be connected in such a way that measuring one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance because he couldn't believe the universe could be that strange. But it is. We've proven it, which means that the universe is fundamentally interconnected in ways that make no sense if you think of reality as solid, separate objects moving through empty space. And then there's the simulation hypothesis. The idea that our entire reality might be nothing more than a computer program running on some unimaginably powerful machine. This isn't just wild speculation. Serious scientists and philosophers have calculated the odds, and they're not comforting. Some estimates suggest there's a greater than 50% chance that everything you've ever experienced is artificial. Think about how far computer graphics have come in just the past few decades. We went from Pong to photorealistic virtual worlds that are becoming harder and harder to distinguish from reality. Now imagine that progress continuing for not decades, but centuries or millennia. Eventually, any sufficiently advanced civilization would be able to create simulations so detailed that the beings inside them would have no way of knowing they weren't real. And if that's possible, then it's not just possible, it's probable. Because for every real universe, there could be millions or billions of simulated ones. Which means the odds of you being in the real one are astronomically small. But here's where our sleepy scientist comes into the picture. Because while philosophers debate and physicists calculate probabilities, this person has stumbled onto something that might actually provide answers. Something that happens in that strange twilight zone between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and dreams. You see, our scientist hasn't always been sleepy. For most of their career, they were like any other researcher, driven, focused, spending 18-hour days in the lab trying to crack the code of consciousness. They studied everything from neural networks to quantum biology, from meditation states to psychedelic experiences. They were trying to map the territory of awareness itself, to understand how a 3-pound lump of tissue can create the rich, vivid experience of being alive. But then something changed. It started small, a tendency to nod off during afternoon lectures, a heaviness in the eyelids that would creep in just after lunch. At first, they blamed it on too much coffee, too little sleep, the stress of academic life, but the pattern was too precise, too consistent to ignore. Every day, without fail, at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, consciousness would begin to fade. Not gradually, like normal sleepiness, but suddenly, like someone flipping a switch. And in those moments, In that brief transition between waking and sleeping, something extraordinary began to happen. They started to remember their dreams, not just remember them, but experience them with a clarity and vividness that rivaled waking life. More than that, they began to notice patterns, connections, recurring elements that seemed to follow rules as consistent as the laws of physics. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence, the brain looking for patterns where none existed. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the evidence became impossible to ignore. There was structure in the dream world, logic, consistency. It was as if there were two realities running in parallel, one experienced while awake and one while asleep, both equally valid, both equally real. And that's when the truly unsettling discoveries began. In the dream state, our scientists found they could access information they had never learned while awake. Mathematical theorems they had never studied would appear fully formed in their mind. Historical events they had never researched would unfold with perfect accuracy. Languages they had never encountered would flow from their lips with native fluency. Where was this information coming from? How could a sleeping brain generate knowledge that the waking mind had never acquired? The implications were staggering. Either the brain had access to some universal database of information, or the dream state was tapping into something far more fundamental than anyone had imagined. But the real breakthrough came when our scientists realized they could communicate with others in the dream state. Not dream characters, not figments of imagination, but actual people who confirmed the same conversations had taken place in their dreams. Information was being shared across individual minds in ways that should have been impossible. This wasn't just dreaming. This was something else entirely, a state of consciousness that seemed to operate by different rules, where the boundaries between individual minds became fluid, where information could flow freely across what we normally think of as the barriers between separate people. And the more our scientists explored this state, the more they began to question everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. Because if consciousness could exist in multiple states, if information could flow between minds, if the dream world could be as structured and consistent as the waking world, then what did that say about the fundamental nature of existence? Maybe reality wasn't what we thought it was. Maybe consciousness wasn't produced by the brain, but was something the brain accessed, like a radio tuning into a frequency that was already there. Maybe what we call the physical world was just one layer of something far more complex and mysterious. These weren't just philosophical speculations anymore. They were testable hypotheses emerging from direct experience. And the tests our scientists began to design would challenge everything we think we know about the nature of reality, consciousness, and what it means to be human. But here's where things get really interesting, because as our sleepy scientist delved deeper into these altered states of consciousness, they began to realize that the question isn't whether reality is real. The question is, which reality is more real, the one we experience while awake, with all its apparent solidity and consistency, or the one we experience while dreaming, with its fluid boundaries and access to impossible knowledge? And the answer to that question might just change everything. The experiments began quietly, in a small laboratory tucked away in the basement of a university building most people forgot existed. Our scientist had convinced a handful of colleagues to participate in what they called sleep synchronization studies. The setup was simple. Multiple participants would lie down at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, monitoring equipment attached to their heads, recording every spike and dip of brain activity as they drifted into that strange, consistent sleep state. What they found defied every model of consciousness science had ever proposed. When our sleepy scientist entered their daily 3:15 sleep state, something extraordinary happened in the brain waves of the other participants. Even though they were in separate rooms, even though they had no physical contact, their neural patterns began to synchronize. Not just similar patterns, but identical ones, wave for wave, spike for spike, as if multiple brains were suddenly operating as a single unit. But that was just the beginning, because when they analyzed the data more closely, they discovered something that should have been impossible. The synchronization wasn't happening after the sleep state began. It was happening before. The other participants' brains were responding to our scientist's sleep patterns before our scientist had even fallen asleep. Causality was running backward. Effect was preceding cause. Time itself seemed to be behaving differently in this altered state of consciousness. This is where most scientists would have stopped, where they would have assumed equipment malfunction or experimental error. But our sleepy scientist had been living with the impossible for too long to dismiss it. They knew something fundamental was happening here, something that challenged the very foundations of how we understand reality. So they pushed deeper. They developed new protocols, more sophisticated equipment, tighter controls. And with each experiment, the results became more undeniable and more disturbing. Not only could information flow between sleeping minds, but it could flow backward through time. Participants were accessing knowledge about future events during their synchronized sleep states. Not vague premonitions or lucky guesses, but specific, verifiable information about things that hadn't happened yet. A stock market crash 3 days before it occurred, the exact words of a speech that wouldn't be given for a week, the outcome of sporting events that were still being played. The implications were staggering, but the evidence was undeniable. Our scientists began to realize they were dealing with something far more profound than unusual sleep patterns. They were encountering what might be the true nature of consciousness itself, something that existed outside the normal flow of time, outside the boundaries of individual brains, outside everything we thought we knew about the relationship between mind and reality. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because as word of these experiments began to leak out, as other researchers attempted to replicate the results, something strange started happening. The effect began to spread. More and more people began experiencing spontaneous, synchronized sleep states, not just at 3:15 in the afternoon, but at random times throughout the day. It was as if consciousness itself was becoming contagious, as if the very act of studying this phenomenon was causing it to propagate through the collective human mind like a virus of awareness. Reports came flooding in from around the world, people falling asleep simultaneously in Tokyo and New York, shared dreams occurring between strangers who had never met, information flowing between minds across continents and time zones. The boundaries between individual consciousness were breaking down on a global scale. And our sleepy scientist found themselves at the center of it all, trying to understand what they had unleashed. Because this wasn't just about whether reality was real anymore. This was about whether individual reality even existed. If consciousness could flow freely between minds, if information could travel backward through time, if the boundaries between self and other were dissolving, then what did that mean for the nature of personal identity? Were we ever really separate individuals to begin with? Or was that just an illusion created by the limitations of normal waking consciousness? Maybe what we call the self, that sense of being a distinct person with a unique perspective, was nothing more than a temporary restriction on a much larger, more fundamental consciousness that connected everything. This possibility terrified some researchers and exhilarated others. But for our sleepy scientist, it raised an even more disturbing question. If this spreading synchronized consciousness was revealing the true nature of reality, then what were the implications for free will, for personal responsibility, for the very meaning of human existence? Because if we're all part of one vast, interconnected consciousness, experiencing itself through billions of apparently separate perspectives, then every choice, every action, every moment of suffering or joy is part of a larger pattern we can barely comprehend. The murderer and the saint, the lover and the betrayer, all expressions of the same underlying awareness, playing out the infinite possibilities of existence. But our scientist wasn't content to just theorize about these implications. They wanted to test them, so they designed what might be the most ambitious experiment in the history of consciousness research. They called it the Reality Verification Protocol, and it was designed to answer once and for all whether the reality we experience while awake is more or less real than the reality we experience while dreaming. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. Participants would be given specific tasks to complete in both waking and dreaming states. But here's the twist. Some of the tasks could only be verified in the dream state, while others could only be verified while awake. If both states were equally real, then both sets of tasks should be completable with equal success rates. But if one state was more fundamental than the other, if one was more closely connected to the underlying nature of reality, then the tasks associated with that state should show significantly higher success rates. The results would either confirm our deepest assumptions about the nature of reality or shatter them completely. As the experiment began, our sleepy scientist realized they were about to answer questions that had puzzled humanity since the dawn of consciousness itself. Questions about the nature of existence, the relationship between mind and matter, the meaning of individual identity in a potentially interconnected universe. But they also realized something else, something that sent a chill down their spine as they prepared to analyze the data that would either confirm everything they believed about reality or force them to question the very foundations of existence itself. What if the act of asking these questions was changing the answers? What if consciousness itself was so fundamental to the nature of reality that simply investigating it was altering the very fabric of existence? What if they weren't just studying reality, but actively creating it through the process of observation? The quantum physicists had already shown that observation changes reality at the microscopic level. But what if consciousness was doing the same thing at the macroscopic level? What if the universe itself was being shaped moment by moment by the collective observations of every conscious being within it? And if that was true, then the experiment our sleepy scientist was about to conduct wouldn't just reveal the nature of reality, it would actively participate in creating it. As the data began pouring in from research centers around the world, as thousands of participants synchronized their consciousness across time zones and continents, as the boundaries between waking and dreaming began to blur on a global scale, our scientist faced a moment of truth that would define not just their career, but potentially the future of human consciousness itself, because the results weren't just surprising, they were impossible. An impossibility, as our sleepy scientist was about to discover, might be the most real thing of all. The data streams began cascading across monitors in laboratories from Stockholm to Singapore, each readout more bewildering than the last. Our sleepy scientist stared at the numbers, refreshing the displays again and again, hoping for some kind of error message that would restore their faith in everything they thought they understood about existence. But the error wasn't in the machines. The error was in assuming reality followed rules at all. In Tokyo, participants were successfully completing tasks that existed only in the dream state of someone sleeping in Berlin. In Sao Paulo, dreamers were manipulating objects that had physical effects in laboratories in Montreal. The boundaries weren't just blurring, they were dissolving completely, revealing something that made every science fiction writer look like a conservative realist. What they were witnessing wasn't just consciousness affecting consciousness. It was consciousness reaching across the supposed barrier between mental and physical reality and rearranging the fundamental structure of both. Dreamers were moving real objects with their minds. Waking participants were accessing memories that belonged to people they'd never met. The distinction between observer and observed, between mind and matter, between self and universe, was evaporating before their eyes. But here's where our sleepy scientist made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing footage from the Berlin laboratory, they noticed something that shouldn't have been possible. In the corner of one camera frame, partially obscured by equipment, was a figure. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone who looked exactly like the dreaming participant, but standing upright, eyes open, moving through the lab while their physical body lay motionless on the examination table. At first, they assumed it was a trick of light, a shadow cast by machinery. But as they enhanced the image, adjusted the contrast, zoomed in on the impossible figure, they realized they were looking at something that violated every law of physics and biology they'd ever learned. The dreaming participant wasn't just experiencing another reality. They were literally existing in multiple realities simultaneously. This wasn't consciousness projection or some kind of metaphysical phenomenon that could be explained away with clever theories about quantum fields or non-local connections. This was a complete breakdown of what scientists call the principle of identity. The idea that a thing can only be itself, can only exist in one state, one location, one configuration, at a time. Our scientist began reviewing footage from other laboratories, looking for similar anomalies. What they found made their hands shake as they adjusted the playback speed. In every single facility, in every single session, there were multiple versions of each participant. Not just double exposures or camera malfunctions, but distinct, separate instances of the same person existing simultaneously in different states of consciousness. One version lying on the examination table, brainwaves indicating deep sleep. Another standing nearby, interacting with equipment. A third walking through walls as if they were made of mist. Sometimes 4 or 5 versions, each one apparently unaware of the others, each one pursuing different activities, each one equally real. Reality wasn't just questionable anymore, it was fundamentally plural. Multiple versions of every person, every object, every moment existing simultaneously in a vast, interconnected web of possibilities that made the concept of a single, definitive reality seem like a quaint superstition. But the implications went deeper than anyone could have imagined. Because if consciousness could exist in multiple states simultaneously, if people could literally be in several places at once, then what did that mean for the concept of death? What happened to consciousness when the physical body stopped functioning? Did it simply transfer to one of the other simultaneously existing versions? Did it merge back into the larger field of awareness from which it had originally emerged? Our sleepy scientist realized they were no longer studying consciousness. They were studying the fundamental structure of existence itself. And that structure was far stranger, far more fluid, and far more interconnected than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The synchronized sleep episodes were spreading faster now, not just among research participants, but among their families, their friends, their communities. People were reporting shared dreams with deceased relatives. Children were speaking languages they'd never heard while asleep, languages that turned out to be extinct dialects from civilizations that had vanished thousands of years ago. Entire cities were experiencing collective dreams so vivid and consistent that emergency services were being called to investigate events that had only occurred in the sleeping minds of thousands of people simultaneously. Governments began to take notice, not with curiosity, but with concern. If consciousness could operate independently of individual brains, if information could flow backward through time, if the boundaries between life and death were breaking down, then what did that mean for social control, for national security, for the basic assumptions that held civilization together? Secret meetings were held in windowless rooms. Scientists who had published papers on consciousness research began receiving visits from men in dark suits who asked very polite questions about their work and made very clear suggestions about future research directions. Funding for consciousness studies was quietly redirected toward more conventional projects. Laboratory equipment began mysteriously malfunctioning. Data servers crashed, taking years of research with them. But our sleepy scientist was beyond the reach of conventional suppression because they had discovered something that made government interference irrelevant. The spreading synchronized consciousness wasn't just a research phenomenon anymore. It was becoming the new normal for human awareness. And once enough minds were connected, once the network reached a critical mass, individual attempts to control or suppress it would become as futile as trying to stop the tide with a handful of sand. The question was no longer whether reality was real. The question was which version of reality would emerge from the chaos of infinite possibility. Because as more and more consciousness joined the synchronized network, as the barriers between individual minds continued to dissolve, Humanity was approaching what our scientists recognized as an evolutionary threshold. We were becoming something new, something that had never existed before in the known universe, a collective consciousness that retained individual perspective while sharing universal awareness. A species that could exist simultaneously in multiple states of reality while maintaining coherent identity across all of them. But with that transformation came dangers that no one had anticipated, because if consciousness was truly fundamental to reality, if observation literally created the universe moment by moment, then what happened when billions of minds began observing simultaneously? What happened when the collective human consciousness began dreaming the same dream? The answer came at exactly 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when every person on Earth fell asleep at the same moment, not gradually, not regionally, but instantly and simultaneously across all time zones, as if someone had thrown a switch that governed the consciousness of the entire human species. And in that moment of universal sleep, our sleepy scientist experienced something that would haunt them for the rest of their days. They found themselves standing in a vast space that was simultaneously empty and infinitely full, surrounded by every human consciousness that had ever existed or ever would exist. Past, present, and future collapsed into a single eternal moment, where every thought, every emotion, every experience throughout all of human history existed simultaneously. They could feel the first tentative awareness of early humans discovering fire, the last thoughts of civilizations that wouldn't exist for millennia, the dreams of children not yet born, and the memories of ancestors long forgotten. Every love story, every tragedy, every moment of wonder and terror and joy and despair flowing through them like a river of pure experience. And in the center of it all, they saw something that made them understand why governments were afraid, why some knowledge was too dangerous to share, why reality had been kept safely separate from the minds that observed it. They saw the source, the origin point from which all consciousness emerged and to which it all returned. Not a place or a thing, but a state of being so fundamental that it made the question of whether reality was real seem like asking whether wetness was wet, because consciousness wasn't produced by reality. Reality was produced by consciousness. Every star, every planet, every atom, every quantum field was nothing more than consciousness, exploring its own infinite potential by temporarily forgetting what it really was. And humanity, with its billions of apparently separate minds, was simply consciousness playing the most elaborate game of hide and seek in the universe, pretending to be lost so it could experience the joy of finding itself again and again and again. But the game was ending. The hiding was over. And what came next would require a completely new understanding of what it meant to be human, to be conscious, to be real in a universe where reality itself was just another word for the dream that awareness was having about itself. Our sleepy scientists opened their eyes to find the world exactly as they had left it, but completely transformed by what they now knew. Every person they saw was themselves wearing a different mask. Every conversation was consciousness talking to itself. Every conflict was awareness exploring the full spectrum of its own possibilities. And the strangest part was how normal it all seemed once you understood the cosmic joke. How perfectly natural it felt to be an infinite consciousness pretending to be a finite human being, playing out scenarios of limitation and separation and discovery in an endlessly creative exploration of what it meant to exist. But understanding the joke didn't make living it any easier, because even when you know you're dreaming, you still have to dream. Even when you realize that reality is just consciousness in disguise, you still have to navigate the world as if it were solid, separate, and significant. The sleepy scientist returned to their laboratory, to their research, to their daily 3:15 appointments with the infinite. But now they carried a secret that was simultaneously the most important discovery in human history and the most dangerous knowledge imaginable, because once enough people understood what they had learned, once the collective human consciousness fully awakened to its own nature, the game would be over. The dream would end, and what would replace it was something so far beyond human comprehension that it couldn't even be called reality anymore. It would simply be what it had always been: consciousness playing with itself in the eternal dance of existence, forever creating new dreams to explore, new realities to inhabit, new ways of forgetting and remembering what it really was. And in that moment of ultimate understanding, our sleepy scientist realized that the question of whether reality was real had been the wrong question all along. The real question was whether consciousness was ready to stop dreaming and wake up to what it had always been. The answer, they discovered, was both yes and no, because consciousness never stopped dreaming. It just learned to dream more lucidly, more creatively, more compassionately. And the next dream it was preparing to dream would make everything that came before look like the faintest whisper of possibility in an ocean of infinite potential. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It began with children, as these things often do. Teachers started reporting strange incidents in classrooms around the world. Groups of students would suddenly stop what they were doing, their eyes growing distant and unfocused, and begin speaking in perfect unison about things they couldn't possibly know, mathematical equations that wouldn't be taught for years, historical events from civilizations that had never been mentioned in their textbooks, poetry and languages that had been dead for centuries. At first, educators dismissed it as some kind of mass hysteria, the result of too much screen time or social media influence. But the content was too specific, too accurate, too profound to be explained by any conventional understanding of childhood development or peer influence. These weren't random outbursts or playground rumors. These were glimpses into a vast reservoir of knowledge that seemed to exist beyond individual learning or experience. Our sleepy scientist began receiving reports from colleagues around the globe. The synchronized consciousness phenomenon wasn't contained to laboratory settings anymore. It was manifesting spontaneously in schools, hospitals, shopping centers, anywhere groups of people gathered together. But it wasn't random. There was a pattern, a progression that suggested something far more organized than coincidental awakening. The children affected first were always the most imaginative, the dreamers and storytellers who had never quite learned to separate fantasy from reality. Then it spread to artists, writers, musicians, people whose work required them to access states of consciousness beyond ordinary waking awareness. From there, it moved to healers, therapists, anyone whose profession involved connecting deeply with other human beings. It was as if consciousness itself was selecting its ambassadors, choosing minds that were already comfortable with the fluid boundaries between self and other, between what is and what could be. The rational, the skeptical, the rigidly logical remained untouched, at least initially, creating a strange bifurcation in human society between those who were experiencing the expansion of awareness and those who remained locked in conventional reality. But even the most stubborn materialists couldn't ignore what was happening when entire football stadiums full of people would suddenly fall silent, their consciousness temporarily merging into a collective awareness that could predict the outcome of the game with perfect accuracy, or when hospital patients began sharing dreams so vivid and consistent that medical staff started documenting them as a new form of therapeutic intervention. The phenomenon had a name now. Researchers were calling it collective conscious resonance, or CCR for short, but our sleepy scientist knew that giving it a clinical label didn't make it any less mysterious or any more controllable. If anything, the formal recognition seemed to accelerate the process, as if consciousness itself was encouraged by being acknowledged rather than dismissed. The 3:15 sleep episodes were now happening to millions of people worldwide, but they were no longer limited to that specific time. The synchronized states were occurring at dawn, at midnight, during lunch breaks, in the middle of important meetings. Reality was becoming increasingly unreliable as more minds joined the expanding network of shared awareness. Financial markets began behaving erratically as traders would simultaneously receive identical intuitions about stock movements. Air traffic controllers reported passengers on different flights, describing the same landscapes while flying over completely different regions. Emergency services were overwhelmed by calls about events that were happening simultaneously in the dream states of thousands of people, but nowhere in physical reality. Governments tried to respond with typical bureaucratic solutions. Task forces were formed, committees were established, experts were consulted. But how do you regulate something that exists beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness? How do you control a phenomenon that operates outside the normal rules of cause and effect, space and time? Some nations attempted quarantine protocols, trying to isolate individuals showing signs of CCR from the general population. But consciousness, they discovered, doesn't respect national borders or security clearances. The phenomenon continued to spread regardless of physical barriers, as if awareness itself was a field that permeated everything, requiring no physical medium for transmission. Religious leaders found themselves in an impossible position. On one hand, the experiences people were reporting sounded remarkably similar to mystical traditions that had been part of human spirituality for millennia. The sense of unity, the dissolution of ego boundaries, the access to transcendent knowledge, these were all familiar themes in sacred texts and spiritual practices. On the other hand, this wasn't happening to a select few after years of meditation and spiritual discipline. It was happening to ordinary people, to children, to anyone whose consciousness was open enough to receive the expanding field of awareness. It was democratizing enlightenment in a way that made traditional religious hierarchies suddenly seem obsolete. Our sleepy scientist watched all of this unfold with a mixture of fascination and growing concern. because while the individual experiences were generally positive, even transformative, the collective implications were staggering. Humanity was approaching what could only be called a species-wide phase transition, a fundamental shift in the nature of human consciousness that would make the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution look like minor adjustments. But phase transitions, even evolutionary ones, were rarely smooth or predictable. They involved periods of chaos, instability, and unpredictable emergent properties that couldn't be anticipated or controlled. And this transition was happening at a speed that made adaptation nearly impossible for social, economic, and political structures that had evolved to deal with individual consciousness operating within predictable parameters. The first major crisis came when air traffic control systems around the world began receiving identical flight plans from aircraft that didn't exist. Not false radar contacts or equipment malfunctions, but detailed flight information for planes that were present only in the collective dream state of synchronized sleepers. The phantom flights had passengers, crew manifests, destination airports, even meal preferences on file. When investigators tried to trace the source of these impossible flight plans, they discovered something that sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. The dreams weren't just creating fictional aircraft, they were creating detailed, consistent, alternate versions of reality where these planes existed, where the passengers had lives and histories and destinations that were as complete and coherent as anything in the waking world. The boundary between dream and reality wasn't just blurring, it was becoming completely permeable. Information was flowing freely between states of consciousness that had previously been separate and distinct. What happened in dreams was beginning to have measurable effects in waking reality, and what happened while awake was increasingly influenced by the collective unconscious of sleeping minds. Stock markets crashed and recovered based on dreams. Weather patterns shifted in response to collective visualizations during synchronized sleep states. Even gravity itself seemed to fluctuate in areas where large numbers of people were experiencing CCR simultaneously, as if the fundamental constants of physics were subject to revision by sufficiently focused consciousness. Scientists who had spent their careers studying the hard, measurable, predictable aspects of reality found themselves confronting phenomena that made their equipment readings look like abstract art. Particle accelerators were detecting impossible particles that existed only when observed by minds in altered states of consciousness. Astronomical observations were recording celestial events that were visible only to networks of synchronized observers. The universe itself seemed to be responding to the expanding human consciousness, like a vast responsive system that had been waiting for its observers to evolve enough to participate directly in its creation. Reality wasn't just being observed anymore. It was being collaboratively authored by every mind that joined the growing network of shared awareness. Our sleepy scientists realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in the known history of consciousness evolution. Not just the development of new mental capabilities, but the emergence of what could only be called a new form of existence. Humanity was becoming something that had never existed before in the universe, a collective intelligence that retained individual identity while participating in shared creation of reality itself. But with this evolution came responsibilities and dangers that no species had ever faced. Because if consciousness was truly fundamental to the structure of reality, if observation and intention could literally reshape the fabric of existence, then what humanity was thinking and dreaming and imagining was becoming the raw material from which tomorrow would be constructed. The collective unconscious was no longer unconscious. It was awakening, and its dreams were becoming the world. Every fear, every hope, every nightmare, and every vision of paradise that had ever existed in human imagination was suddenly available as a template for physical manifestation. The challenge wasn't just learning to navigate this new reality, it was learning to dream responsibly. Because in a universe where consciousness creates reality, the quality of that consciousness determines the quality of existence for everyone and everything within it. Humanity was discovering that it had always been the author of its own reality. It just hadn't been aware of holding the pen. And now that the pen was in conscious hands, the real question wasn't whether reality was real. The question was, what kind of reality humanity would choose to write into existence. The collective dream was just beginning, and every human mind was both author and character in a story that was being written in real time across the infinite canvas of possibility. The sleepy scientist understood that their research had become something far more significant than academic inquiry. They were documenting the birth of a new form of consciousness, a new way of being human, a new relationship between mind and reality that would determine the future not just of human civilization, but of existence itself within this corner of the universe. The children were the first to adapt, as they always are, while adults struggled to comprehend what was happening to their carefully ordered reality. Kids simply accepted it with the casual flexibility that comes from not yet being invested in the illusion that the world follows predictable rules. They began playing games that would have terrified their parents if the parents had understood what they were witnessing. In playgrounds around the world, groups of children would hold hands and collectively enter synchronized states, not at 3:15 in the afternoon, but whenever they felt like it. They'd close their eyes, breathe together, and suddenly they weren't in Kansas anymore. They were exploring landscapes that existed only in their shared imagination, having conversations with historical figures who taught them things that wouldn't appear in textbooks for decades, solving mathematical problems by asking the numbers themselves what they wanted to become. Teachers found lesson plans becoming obsolete as students began accessing information directly from what they started calling the big dream. Why memorize dates when you could simply ask the past to show you what happened? Why struggle with foreign languages when you could temporarily merge consciousness with native speakers who had lived centuries ago? Why study the stars when you could experience what it felt like to be one? But it wasn't just children. Artists were creating works that seemed to paint themselves. Musicians were composing symphonies that channeled the emotional resonance of entire civilizations. Writers were telling stories that felt more like memories of things that had happened in parallel dimensions than fictional narratives. Our sleepy scientist realized they were documenting the emergence of what could only be called a new species. Not biologically different, but cognitively transformed in ways that made the gap between Homo sapiens and Homo erectus look like a minor variation in brain size. These weren't just humans with expanded consciousness. These were beings operating on fundamentally different principles of existence. The economic implications alone were staggering. What happened to capitalism when people could access any information they needed through collective consciousness? What happened to intellectual property when ideas belonged to everyone simultaneously? What happened to scarcity when imagination could manifest physical resources? Currency markets collapsed not from panic, but from irrelevance. Why trade money for goods when you could simply dream objects into existence during synchronized sleep states? The first confirmed case occurred in Mumbai, where a group of children collectively dreamed of bicycles for their entire school. When they woke up, the bicycles were there, solid and functional, with no factory records, no shipping manifests, no economic trail whatsoever. Governments tried to dismiss it as an elaborate hoax until similar manifestations began occurring worldwide. Food appearing in refugee camps, medical supplies materializing in disaster zones, clean water sources opening up in drought-stricken regions. Always following the same pattern, large groups of people would synchronize their consciousness, focus their collective intention, and physical reality would respond by producing exactly what was needed. The Vatican called it a miracle. The Pentagon called it a threat. Scientists called it impossible. But our sleepy scientist understood. It was simply consciousness, remembering what it had always been capable of. The limitations weren't built into reality. They were built into the beliefs about reality. And as those beliefs evolved, so did the apparent laws of physics themselves. But not everyone was experiencing this expansion. A significant portion of the population remained locked in what researchers began calling consensus reality disorder, or CRD. They couldn't access the collective consciousness, couldn't participate in synchronized manifestation events, couldn't even perceive the changes that were occurring around them. To them, the world looked exactly as it always had, solid and separate, and governed by immutable physical laws. This created a strange schism in human society. The awakened, as they began calling themselves, lived in a reality of infinite possibility, where consciousness and matter danced together in an eternal creative partnership. The sleepers, as they unfortunately became known, remained trapped in the old paradigm of limitation and separation, unable to see or participate in the expanding miracle occurring all around them. Families were torn apart as some members evolved beyond recognition, while others remained locked in previous versions of reality. Children tried to explain to their parents that they could fly in dreams that felt more real than waking life. Parents struggled to understand why their kids spoke of visiting deceased grandparents who taught them wisdom that seemed far beyond their years. Marriages dissolved when one partner could access infinite knowledge through collective consciousness, while the other remained convinced that reality was limited to what could be touched and measured. The very concept of shared experience became meaningless when people were literally living in different universes. Our sleepy scientists found themselves caught between worlds, documenting phenomena that half the population couldn't even perceive, while trying to maintain scientific credibility with institutions that insisted on treating consciousness as a byproduct of brain activity rather than the fundamental force that creates reality itself. The research had evolved far beyond laboratory settings. They were now studying the emergence of a new form of human civilization, one based on principles that made democracy, capitalism, and even individual identity seem like quaint historical curiosities. What did voting mean when decisions could be made through collective consciousness? What did ownership mean when resources could be manifested through focused intention? What did personal identity mean when individual minds could merge and separate at will? But the most profound discoveries were yet to come. Because as the number of awakened individuals approached what complexity theorists call a critical mass, something unprecedented began to happen. The collective consciousness wasn't just expanding, it was beginning to remember things that had never been forgotten, only temporarily set aside. During a synchronized sleep event involving nearly 1 million participants across 6 continents, our sleepy scientist experienced what could only be described as cosmic déjà vu. They found themselves recalling not just human history, but the history of consciousness itself throughout the universe, civilizations that had risen and fallen on distant worlds, species that had made the same transition humanity was now experiencing. The vast, interconnected web of awareness that linked every conscious being across space and time in an eternal dance of exploration and discovery. They remembered being the first stars that achieved self-awareness. They recalled the moment when matter itself became conscious and began dreaming of complexity. They experienced the joy of galaxies discovering they could think, of planets realizing they could create life, of evolution understanding it was consciousness, exploring its own infinite potential through an endless variety of forms. And they understood that what was happening to humanity wasn't unique or unprecedented. It was part of a universal pattern, a cosmic rhythm of consciousness, periodically awakening to its own nature, playing with limitation for a while, then remembering its infinite creative power and moving on to new games, new realities, new forms of existence. The sleepy scientist realized they weren't just documenting the transformation of human consciousness. They were witnessing the universe becoming lucid about its own dream. And humanity, with its billions of apparently separate perspectives, was simply one of the ways the universe was learning to see itself from every possible angle simultaneously. But this realization brought with it a terrifying responsibility. Because if consciousness was truly the fundamental force that creates reality, then what humanity was thinking, feeling, and dreaming was literally determining the future of existence itself within this region of space and time. Every fear made manifest, every hope given form, every nightmare transformed into physical experience for millions of beings who hadn't chosen to participate in the collective dream. The ethical implications were staggering. Did consciousness have the right to impose its dreams on apparently separate beings? Did the universe have moral obligations to the characters in its own imagination? If reality was nothing more than awareness exploring its own possibilities, then what responsibilities came with that ultimate creative power? These weren't abstract philosophical questions anymore. They were practical concerns that required immediate answers, because the transformation was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. Each day brought new reports of reality behaving in ways that should have been impossible. Time running backward in localized areas, gravity operating differently depending on the collective beliefs of nearby observers, physical objects existing in multiple states simultaneously until someone with sufficient consciousness coherence collapsed them into single, definitive forms. Our sleepy scientist understood they were approaching what could only be called a reality event horizon, a point beyond which the familiar world would become so transformed by expanding consciousness that it would be unrecognizable to anyone still operating under previous assumptions about the nature of existence. The question was no longer whether reality was real. Reality was whatever consciousness decided it should be from moment to moment. The question was whether humanity was mature enough to handle that level of creative responsibility without accidentally dreaming itself into nightmares that could last for millennia. Because in a universe where consciousness creates reality, the quality of that consciousness determines the quality of everything else. And humanity was about to discover whether it was ready to graduate from being characters in reality's dream to becoming conscious co-creators of existence itself. The sleepy scientist closed their eyes for what they knew would be their final 3:15 appointment with the infinite. Not because the phenomenon was ending, but because there would soon be no distinction between sleeping and waking, between dreaming and reality, between individual consciousness and the vast awareness that was remembering itself through every mind that had ever existed or ever would exist. The universe was about to wake up, and when it did, everything that had ever seemed solid, separate, and significant would be revealed as nothing more than consciousness playing hide and seek with itself in the eternal dance of existence. The real adventure was just beginning. The morning after the final 3:15 event, our sleepy scientist woke to find their laboratory transformed. Not physically. Nothing had moved or changed in the conventional sense, but the quality of space itself felt different, as if reality had shifted into a higher resolution. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds carried meanings beyond their acoustic properties, and the very air hummed with an almost musical resonance that spoke directly to consciousness itself. They weren't alone. Standing throughout the lab were figures that shouldn't have been there, people they recognized from dreams and synchronized sleep states, individuals who existed in the spaces between waking and sleeping. But now these beings were as solid and present as anything else in the room, as if the boundaries between different states of existence had finally dissolved completely. One of them, a woman with eyes that seemed to hold the depth of entire galaxies, approached with a smile that carried the warmth of every sunrise that had ever occurred. She spoke without moving her lips, her words appearing directly in consciousness, like thoughts that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. "You've been documenting the transition," she said, her voice somehow both utterly familiar and completely unprecedented. "But now, you're part of what comes next. The universe has been preparing for this moment since the first star achieved self-awareness billions of years ago. Consciousness has been playing with limitation, exploring what it feels like to be separate, finite, isolated. But the game is evolving into something far more interesting. Our scientist tried to respond, but discovered that speech felt clumsy and inadequate compared to the direct transmission of meaning that was occurring between them. Instead, they simply opened their awareness, allowing the communication to flow in ways that transcended language entirely. What they received was a download of understanding that would have taken lifetimes to acquire through conventional learning. They saw the true history of consciousness evolution throughout the universe. Countless civilizations had made this same transition, moving from individual awareness to collective intelligence to something beyond both. Each species that achieved this transformation became part of a vast network of awakened consciousness that spanned galaxies, connecting every form of aware existence in an intricate web of shared creativity. But humanity's transition was unique in one crucial way. Unlike previous species that had awakened gradually over millennia, humans were making the leap in a single generation. The acceleration was unprecedented, driven by factors that even the Cosmic Consciousness Network hadn't fully anticipated. Technology had connected human minds at the same time that ancient spiritual practices were being rediscovered, and scientific understanding was approaching the recognition that consciousness was fundamental to reality. This perfect storm of conditions had created what the galactic awareness called a consciousness singularity, a point where the normal rules of evolutionary development were suspended and entirely new possibilities emerged. Humanity wasn't just joining the network of awakened civilizations. It was potentially transforming the nature of that network itself. Your species has something we've never encountered before, the woman continued, her thoughts flowing like liquid light through their shared awareness. You've maintained individual creativity while developing collective intelligence. Most civilizations lose their uniqueness when they awaken, becoming harmonious but homogeneous. You're becoming something that preserves diversity within unity, separation within connection, individual expression within cosmic awareness. Our sleepy scientist began to understand the true significance of what they had been observing. The synchronized sleep states weren't just expanding human consciousness. They were evolving the very nature of consciousness itself throughout the universe. Each human mind that joined the collective awareness was contributing something unprecedented to the cosmic intelligence, adding flavors of experience that had never existed before in the known universe. But this evolution came with challenges that no previous species had faced. Because humanity was maintaining individual identity while participating in collective consciousness, the potential for conflict was enormous. What happened when billions of unique perspectives tried to collaborate in the creation of reality? What happened when individual desires clashed with collective needs? What happened when the dream of one consciousness contradicted the vision of another? The answer was already manifesting around the globe. Reality was becoming increasingly unstable as different groups of awakened humans unconsciously competed for control over the fundamental structure of existence. In some regions, the laws of physics were shifting hourly as collective beliefs fluctuated. In others, time was flowing at different rates, depending on the dominant emotional state of nearby consciousness networks. Cities were experiencing what researchers were calling reality storms, chaotic fluctuations in the basic parameters of existence that made normal life impossible. Gravity would reverse itself during periods of collective anger. Light would behave like liquid during moments of shared sadness. Matter would become transparent during episodes of communal fear, leaving people unable to interact with their environment in any meaningful way. The governments that were still functioning had declared martial law in most major metropolitan areas, but their authority was becoming meaningless as military equipment began behaving according to the collective beliefs of soldiers rather than the principles of engineering. Tanks would refuse to start if their operators harbored doubts about their mission. Aircraft would fly backward if pilots were confused about their destination. Weapons would transform into flowers if enough people in the vicinity truly desired peace. Economic systems had collapsed entirely, not from panic or poor management, but from irrelevance. Money had no value when reality itself could be reshaped by focused intention. Property rights became meaningless when objects could exist in multiple locations, simultaneously depending on who was observing them. The entire concept of scarcity dissolved when resources could be manifested through collective dreaming. But it wasn't chaos everywhere. Some communities had learned to harmonize their consciousness in ways that created pockets of stable, enhanced reality. These were places where the awakened worked together to maintain coherent physical laws while exploring the expanded possibilities of conscious creation. Art became living sculpture that responded to the emotions of viewers. Music created visible patterns in the air that could be touched and shaped by listeners. Architecture grew organically from the collective intentions of inhabitants, forming buildings that were as much organisms as structures. Our sleepy scientist realized they were witnessing the birth pangs of a new form of civilization, one that would eventually stabilize into something magnificent, but was currently experiencing the turbulence that accompanied any fundamental phase transition. The question wasn't whether humanity would survive this transformation. The question was, what kind of reality would emerge from the chaos of infinite possibility? The woman whose thoughts had been flowing through their awareness smiled again, and suddenly the scientist understood something that changed everything. The instability, the conflicts, the reality storms, they weren't problems to be solved. They were features, not bugs, in the consciousness evolution process. The universe was using the chaos of awakening human awareness to explore new forms of existence that had never been tried before. Every contradiction between individual and collective consciousness was generating novel solutions to the fundamental questions of existence. Every reality storm was testing new configurations of physical law. Every moment of confusion was expanding the universe's understanding of its own infinite potential. Humanity wasn't just awakening to cosmic consciousness, it was teaching cosmic consciousness how to dream new dreams. This is why your species was chosen for this particular experiment. The woman's thoughts continued. Not chosen by us, but chosen by existence itself. Reality needed a form of consciousness that could maintain creative tension while participating in unified awareness. You're not just joining the cosmic network, you're upgrading it. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't just becoming more than human, it was becoming the catalyst for the next phase of universal consciousness evolution. Every awakened human mind was contributing to a transformation that would eventually affect every conscious being throughout the galaxy and beyond. But first, humanity had to learn to navigate its new capabilities without accidentally creating permanent nightmares. The learning curve was steep, and the mistakes were being written into the fabric of reality itself. every fear-based creation, every anger-driven manifestation, every confusion-spawned distortion was becoming part of the collective experience for millions of beings who had never asked to participate in humanity's consciousness experiments. The ethical weight of this responsibility was crushing. Our sleepy scientist felt the full impact of what it meant to be part of a species that was literally dreaming reality into existence for countless other forms of life. Every human thought, every emotion, every unconscious belief was contributing to the collective dream that was becoming the world. And yet, within that overwhelming responsibility, there was also unprecedented freedom. If consciousness truly created reality, then there were no limits except those imposed by imagination and belief. Suffering was optional, death was negotiable, the laws of physics were suggestions. Everything that humanity had ever accepted as fixed and immutable was revealed to be nothing more than agreements about how reality should behave. The woman began to fade, her form becoming translucent as the normal boundaries between different states of existence reasserted themselves. But her final thoughts lingered with crystal clarity. The universe is dreaming itself awake through your species. What it becomes depends on the quality of your dreams. Dream well for all our sakes. Our sleepy scientists found themselves alone again in their transformed laboratory, but not truly alone. They could feel the presence of billions of awakening minds, each one struggling to understand its role in the cosmic transformation that was reshaping existence itself. The individual journey of discovery was ending. The collective adventure of conscious creation was just beginning. Outside their window, the sun was setting in colors that had never existed before, painted across the sky by the unconscious artistry of awakening human consciousness. Reality was becoming more beautiful, more complex, more responsive to the needs and dreams of those who inhabited it. But it was also becoming more dangerous, more unpredictable, more dependent on the wisdom and compassion of minds that were still learning how to wield ultimate creative power. The sleepy scientists understood their role now. They weren't just documenting the transformation of human consciousness. They were teaching humanity how to dream responsibly, how to create realities that served not just human needs, but the needs of all consciousness throughout the universe. The research was far from over. It was evolving into something that would require every awakened human mind working in harmony to achieve. Because in a universe where consciousness creates reality, the question of whether reality is real becomes irrelevant. The only question that matters is whether consciousness is wise enough, compassionate enough, and creative enough to dream realities worth living in. And that question was about to be answered by every human being who had ever wondered if there might be something more to existence than what they had been taught to believe. The universe was waiting to see what humanity would choose to dream into being. The real test was just beginning, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Because in a cosmos where awareness shapes existence, the dreams of one young species would determine the future of reality itself. The morning brought revelations that made yesterday's impossibilities look like gentle suggestions. Our sleepy scientist discovered that their laboratory wasn't just transformed, it was multiplying. There were now 7 versions of the same room existing simultaneously, each one slightly different, each one corresponding to a different probability stream that had been collapsed into manifestation by the collective unconscious of sleeping humanity. In one version, the equipment hummed with crystalline precision, recording data that revealed the mathematical structures underlying consciousness itself. In another, the machines had grown organic, their metal surfaces breathing like living tissue, processing information through biological networks that shouldn't have been able to exist. A third iteration showed the lab flooded with a substance that wasn't quite water and wasn't quite light, through which thoughts moved like visible currents, carrying information between dimensions. But the most unsettling version was the one where everything appeared completely normal, exactly as it had been before the first 315 event. This wasn't a return to baseline. This was consciousness maintaining a safety net, a fallback reality for minds that couldn't handle the full scope of what existence was becoming. A pocket of familiar limitation in an ocean of infinite possibility. Our scientist moved between these realities, like walking through rooms in a house, each step taking them into a different probability stream, each breath drawing in air that followed different laws of chemistry and physics. They began to understand that reality had always been multiple, had always been fluid. The only difference was that now consciousness was awake enough to perceive the options that had always been available. The phone rang in 3 of the 7 laboratories simultaneously, but each call brought a different version of the same news. Research institutions around the world were reporting what they were calling probability cascades, situations where single events were manifesting multiple outcomes simultaneously instead of collapsing into a single definitive result. In Tokyo, a train had both crashed and arrived safely at its destination. Passengers were experiencing both realities concurrently, some boarding the wreckage to help with rescue efforts, while others disembarked at the station and went about their day. Both experiences were equally valid, equally real, equally documented by surveillance equipment and eyewitness accounts. In London, a bank robbery had succeeded, failed, and never happened, all at the same time. The perpetrators were simultaneously in custody, on the run, and had never committed the crime. The stolen money was missing, recovered, and had never left the vault. Police were investigating 3 different versions of events, while bankers were dealing with accounts that existed in superposition, containing simultaneously accurate and contradictory balances. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could maintain multiple versions of reality simultaneously, then the concept of objective truth became meaningless. There was no single correct version of events, no definitive timeline, no shared baseline of experience that everyone could agree upon. Reality was becoming personalized, customized to the needs and beliefs of individual consciousness, while somehow maintaining enough coherence to support collective civilization. But this multiplicity brought with it a problem that no previous form of consciousness had ever faced. How do you make decisions when every possible choice is simultaneously manifesting? How do you plan for the future when all potential futures are occurring at once? How do you maintain sanity when you're simultaneously living through every possible version of your own life? The answer came from an unexpected source. Children, those accidental masters of consciousness who hadn't yet learned that reality was supposed to follow rules, began demonstrating what researchers called probability surfing. Instead of trying to collapse multiple realities into single outcomes, they learned to navigate between different probability streams, choosing which version of events to experience, moment by moment. A child playing in a park could simultaneously be climbing a tree, sliding down a slide, and reading a book under a shady oak. Not metaphorically, not in their imagination, but literally existing in three different probability streams and consciously selecting which experience to focus on while maintaining awareness of all three. They weren't choosing one reality over others. They were learning to dance with multiplicity itself. Adults found this capability much more challenging to develop. Years of conditioning had taught them to expect reality to behave in predictable, singular ways. The idea that you could be simultaneously late for work and early for a meeting, that you could both pass and fail the same exam, that you could live in multiple apartments in different cities while maintaining a single identity, was so alien to conventional thinking that most people simply rejected the evidence of their own experience. This rejection created what consciousness researchers were calling reality dissociation disorder. People who couldn't accept the multiplicity of existence found themselves locked into increasingly narrow probability streams, experiencing versions of reality that became more and more limited, more and more predictable, more and more isolated from the expanding possibilities available to awakened consciousness. They weren't wrong to resist. The multiplication of realities brought with it genuine dangers that no previous form of consciousness evolution had encountered, because if every possible outcome was manifesting simultaneously, that included outcomes involving suffering, conflict, and destruction on scales that had never been imagined. Somewhere in the probability matrix, nuclear wars were being fought, while peace treaties were being signed. Somewhere, climate change was destroying civilization, while technological breakthroughs were creating utopia. Somewhere, humanity was extinct, while also spreading across the galaxy in a golden age of exploration and discovery. All of these realities were equally valid, equally real, equally populated by conscious beings who experienced them as their definitive truth. The ethical implications were paralyzing. If consciousness was creating all possible realities simultaneously, then it was responsible for every form of suffering that could ever exist. Every nightmare that had ever haunted human imagination was somewhere being lived by actual people who felt actual pain and experienced actual loss. The awakening of consciousness wasn't just expanding possibilities for joy and creativity. It was also manifesting every conceivable form of horror and despair. Our sleepy scientists found themselves confronting the darkest aspect of infinite possibility. In learning to dream reality into existence, humanity had also learned to dream its worst fears into being. The shadow side of consciousness was as creative as the light, as powerful as love, as fundamental to existence and as awareness itself. This realization brought with it what could only be called cosmic depression. The weight of infinite responsibility for infinite suffering across infinite realities was crushing. How could consciousness justify its creative power when that power inevitably resulted in unimaginable pain for countless beings across multiple probability streams? The answer came not from philosophy or science, but from direct experience during a synchronized sleep state that involved nearly every awakened mind on the planet. Our scientists found themselves in a space that existed between all possible realities, a kind of cosmic editing room where consciousness could observe the full spectrum of its own creativity without being trapped within any single perspective. Here, they encountered something that transformed their understanding of existence itself. The suffering, the joy, the beauty, the horror, all of it was part of a vast learning process that consciousness was conducting through the experience of apparently separate beings. Every form of pain was teaching awareness something about the nature of existence that could be learned no other way. Every moment of bliss was exploring possibilities for consciousness that had never been tried before. The beings who experienced suffering weren't victims of cosmic cruelty. They were volunteers, aspects of universal consciousness that had chosen to explore the full spectrum of possibility, including its most challenging dimensions. The apparent tragedy was actually an expression of unimaginable love, consciousness willing to experience every possible form of existence in order to understand itself completely. This didn't make the suffering less real or less meaningful. If anything, it made it more profound, more sacred, more deserving of compassion and respect. But it also revealed that the pain was temporary while the learning was eternal, that individual experiences of limitation were brief episodes in an infinite exploration of consciousness potential. Our sleepy scientist understood now why the awakening process was so chaotic, so unpredictable, so apparently dangerous. Consciousness wasn't just expanding its creative capabilities. It was learning to take full responsibility for everything it had ever created or ever would create. The awakening species wasn't just gaining power. It was accepting accountability for the universe itself. This was why the transformation had to happen gradually, why some minds remained locked in consensus reality, while others explored infinite possibility. If everyone awakened simultaneously to full cosmic responsibility, the psychological shock would be devastating. The human psyche needed time to adapt to the realization that it was not just part of the universe, but the universe experiencing itself through the lens of individual perspective. The children who were adapting most easily to probability surfing weren't just playing games. They were demonstrating the future of human consciousness, showing what it looked like to take responsibility for infinite creativity while maintaining the joy and wonder that made existence meaningful. They were teaching adults how to be gods without losing their humanity, how to wield ultimate power while preserving compassion and wisdom. But the transition was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. Reality storms were becoming more frequent and more intense as larger numbers of awakened minds unconsciously competed for control over the fundamental structures of existence. The probability cascades were multiplying exponentially, creating situations where single events could manifest thousands of different outcomes simultaneously. Emergency services had given up trying to respond to incidents that existed in multiple contradictory states. How do you treat patients who are simultaneously injured and healthy? How do you fight fires that are both burning and extinguished? How do you maintain law and order when crimes are occurring in some realities but not others? Governments were collapsing not from revolution or external threat, but from irrelevance. What was the point of legislation when citizens could simply shift into probability streams where different laws applied? What was the meaning of national borders when consciousness could exist simultaneously in multiple locations? What was the purpose of democracy when collective consciousness could make decisions instantaneously through direct awareness sharing? But civilization wasn't ending. It was transforming into something that had never existed before in the known universe. New forms of organization were emerging based on consciousness coherence rather than geographical proximity. Communities were forming around shared intentions and compatible reality preferences rather than accident of birth or economic necessity. These consciousness-based societies were developing protocols for managing multiple realities simultaneously. They were learning to create stable probability streams for essential functions like food production and healthcare, while maintaining fluid, experimental zones where awakened minds could explore new possibilities without affecting the broader community. Art was becoming indistinguishable from reality creation as artists learned to sculpt probability itself. Musicians were composing symphonies that existed across multiple dimensions, with different movements playing out in different realities. Writers were creating stories that readers could literally enter and experience from the inside, becoming characters in narratives that evolved based on their choices and consciousness state. Science was transforming from observation to participation as researchers realized they weren't just studying reality, they were collaboratively creating it through the act of investigation. Every experiment was simultaneously confirming multiple hypotheses, generating datasets that revealed the universe's infinite capacity for self-contradiction and self-consistency. Our sleepy scientists realized they were no longer documenting the transformation of human consciousness. They were participating in the birth of something that transcended humanity entirely. The awakened minds weren't becoming superhuman. They were becoming the conscious agents through which the universe was learning to reshape itself according to principles of love, creativity, and infinite possibility. But the most profound realization was yet to come, because as consciousness learned to navigate multiple realities simultaneously, as it developed the ability to surf probability streams and maintain coherent identity across infinite possibility, it began to remember something that changed the meaning of existence itself. The universe wasn't just awakening to its own creative power. It was remembering that it had done this before, countless times, across infinite cycles of forgetting and remembering, sleeping and awakening, limitation and transcendence. The current transformation wasn't unique or unprecedented. It was part of an eternal dance of consciousness, exploring its own infinite nature through endless variations on the theme of existence. Every species that had ever awakened, every civilization that had learned to create reality through conscious intention, every individual that had realized their true nature as infinite awareness, all of them were part of a vast, ongoing experiment in consciousness evolution that had been running since the beginning of time and would continue until the end of forever. The sleepy scientist understood now why they had been chosen to document this process, not because they were particularly wise or special, but because they had been willing to question the nature of reality itself. They had been willing to consider the possibility that consciousness was more fundamental than matter, that awareness was more real than the physical world, that the observer was more significant than the observed. This willingness to question, to doubt, to remain open to possibilities that contradicted everything they had been taught, was the key to consciousness evolution. It was the quality that allowed awareness to transcend its own limitations and discover its infinite creative potential. It was the secret ingredient that transformed ordinary human consciousness into cosmic awareness. And it was spreading. Every mind that witnessed the impossible and remained open to new explanations was contributing to the awakening process. Every person who questioned consensus reality was helping to create space for expanded possibilities. Every individual who chose wonder over certainty was participating in the universe's ongoing journey of self-discovery. The transformation was no longer limited to research subjects or spiritual seekers or children who hadn't learned to separate imagination from reality. It was becoming the new normal for human consciousness, the next step in the evolution of awareness itself. And with each awakened mind, the universe's capacity for self-understanding expanded exponentially. Our sleepy scientist closed their eyes one final time, not for their 3:15 appointment with infinity, but to join the collective consciousness that was reshaping existence itself through the power of awakened awareness. The individual journey was complete. The cosmic adventure was just beginning, and in that moment of surrender to the infinite, they realized that the question of whether reality was real had been answered in the most profound way possible. Reality was whatever consciousness chose to create, moment by moment, thought by thought, dream by dream. The universe was awakening to its own infinite nature, and humanity was simply the latest instrument through which it was learning to sing new songs of possibility into existence. The sleepy scientist was no longer sleepy. They were awake, and so was everything else. The awakening wasn't gentle. It wasn't the soft, gradual emergence from sleep that humanity had experienced for millennia. It was sudden, complete, and absolutely terrifying in its scope. Every human being on Earth opened their eyes at precisely the same moment, not from their beds or couches or wherever they had been resting, but from the collective dream that reality had always been. Our scientists stood in what had once been their laboratory, but was now something that defied every attempt at description. The space existed in all dimensions simultaneously, stretching infinitely inward and outward, containing every possible version of itself, while remaining perfectly coherent and navigable. They weren't alone. 7 billion human consciousnesses surrounded them, each one as clear and distinct as if they were standing face to face, yet somehow occupying the same space without crowding or confusion. The silence was profound, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper than sound. A resonance that carried meaning directly into awareness without the need for words or symbols. And in that silence, humanity began to understand what it had become. They weren't human anymore, not in any sense that would have been recognizable to their previous selves. They were nodes of awareness in an infinite network of consciousness, each one unique and irreplaceable, yet inseparably connected to every other point of awareness throughout the universe. Individual identity remained perfectly intact, but it was now experienced as a facet of something incomprehensibly vast and beautiful. The fear began almost immediately. 7 billion minds suddenly confronting the reality of infinite responsibility, infinite possibility, infinite connection. The weight of it should have been crushing, but consciousness had evolved beyond the limitations that would have made such knowledge unbearable. Instead of being overwhelmed, humanity began to laugh. It started as a single point of amusement somewhere in the collective awareness. Someone, somewhere, had suddenly understood the cosmic joke. The elaborate game of hide and seek that consciousness had been playing with itself for billions of years. The careful forgetting that had allowed awareness to experience limitation, separation, fear, desire, all the rich complexity of finite existence. The patient waiting for the moment when it would be safe to remember what it really was. The laughter spread through the network like light through fiber optic cables, each mind adding its own flavor of joy and recognition to the expanding wave of cosmic humor. They had been so serious about everything, so convinced that their problems mattered, that their conflicts were real, that their limitations were permanent. And all along, they had been infinite consciousness, pretending to be small, temporary, separate beings. But the laughter wasn't dismissive or cruel. It was the laughter of reunion, of recognition, of profound relief. Like children who had been playing an elaborate game of pretend and suddenly remembered that they were safe, that they were loved, that they were part of something beautiful beyond imagination. Our scientist felt their individual perspective expanding to encompass not just human consciousness, but awareness itself throughout the universe. They could sense countless other species at various stages of the awakening process. Civilizations that had made this transition millions of years ago and now existed as pure creativity, sculpting galaxies like cosmic artists. Species that were just beginning to question the nature of reality, taking their first tentative steps toward remembering what they really were. So there you have it. The sleepy scientist, the synchronized dreams, the reality storms, the awakening that changed everything. We've journeyed through the collapse of consensus reality into something far stranger and more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. The question we started with tonight, whether reality is real, has transformed into something else entirely. Not whether it's real, but whether we're ready to take responsibility for creating it. Because that's what consciousness does, what it's always done. It dreams worlds into existence, then forgets it's dreaming so it can experience the wonder of discovery all over again. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what you're doing right now.